Hello everyone, and welcome to today's BOC group webinar. I'm quite happy to see all of you here. So the topic of today's webinar is getting started with enterprise architecture, the key factors for implementing enterprise architecture successfully in your organization. To begin with, here are a few tips that will allow you to follow the webinar more effectively. During the webinar, all participants are welcome to ask questions. We will do our best to answer them at the end, but please use the side panel of the webinar application, which is found on the right side of your screen, to do that. Depending on the time remaining at the end, we will select one or two questions and answer them live. And for any questions that remain unanswered, we will be sure to answer via email after the webinar. As a participant, of course, your name and email are anonymous to other participants. Allow me to introduce myself. My name is Marin Tikvica. I will be your host today, and I hope you enjoy our virtual meeting room. As an expert on the topic, I would like to greet my dear colleague, Thomas Brennan, who will lead you through the content-related part of the webinar. So today, our highlights and focus will be to show you the goals and benefits of enterprise architecture, including the concrete examples as such. We will also cover the fundamentals of enterprise architecture management, the implementation of enterprise architecture, and creating transparency and identifying optimization potential. Before we get started, I'd like to give you a brief overview of the activities of the BOC Group. So BOC Group was founded in 1995 as a spin-off of the University of Vienna, and today has more than 230 employees in 8 countries. We sell our products, implementation projects, and consulting services in more than 50 countries, building on with the support of a strong partner network. We are particularly proud that nearly 100,000 users of our free community editions have registered worldwide. With this experience of more than 20 years in IT-based management domains, we now have more than 35,000 installations of our commercial software products in companies all around the world. Our products from the BOC Management Office are primarily aimed at facilitating changes in business and IT. We accomplish this by creating the necessary visibility into your process architecture or enterprise architecture that helps you better understand and control change. The portfolio of our products includes, to begin with, the well-known ADOIT for business process management, analysis and optimization, ADOIT for IT management and enterprise architecture, and GRC for governance, risk, and compliance. All of these products embrace a powerful common platform that allows users to model processes or architectures, run analytics and reports, assess risks, and much, much more through a web-based approach. This platform is characterized by very high flexibility in the configuration, also allowing the implementation of very specific customer requirements through customizing. The BOC Group does not leave its clients to face exciting challenges of the digital transformation alone, even beyond the products. Therefore, we also offer specialist advice, training, and support. In other words, everything from a single source. If you're interested in our portfolio, feel free to contact us directly or visit our website for more details at www.boc-group.com. To wrap things up, our international customers, as well as renowned analysts such as Forrester and Gartner, have become increasingly aware of us in the recent years and are a positive testimony to the developments we have made to date and also to our future plans. Take a few minutes, please, and browse through the respective reviews and reports on our website. With that, without further ado, Tom Brennan is prepared and ready to guide you through the topic, getting started with enterprise architecture.
Okay, thank you, Marin, for the introduction there, and I'd also like to welcome everybody to today's session. As Marin said, we're going to give you an insight into how to get started with enterprise architecture and also look at some of the key factors for a successful implementation. So what can you expect from today's session? We're going to firstly look at a kind of a general overview of what enterprise architecture is and why you need it and some of its benefits. We will then look at how to start kind of an EA initiative and take a look at the relationship between enterprise architecture and TOGA. and also take a look at our procedure model to kickstart an initiative and see how we can answer some typical EA questions. And we'll also finish up today with a summary and some additional enterprise architecture scenarios and run through a quick enterprise architecture checklist at the end. So as already mentioned, a quite fundamental question to start here. So what is enterprise architecture all about? Essentially, these are the activities to implement your company's vision and strategy. So your basic principles and patterns for describing the future state of your enterprise should be created, communicated, and continuously improved upon. And then based on these basic principles that you have, we can examine and analyze our existing architecture, i.e. we take a look at the description of the relationships of the elements from the business application and technology level, and subsequently we define, control, and support using projects or programs that further develop our architecture. So to provide you with a kind of an introduction and explanation of enterprise architecture, I want to use this slide that we have from Professor Winter from the University of St. Gallen. Basically, enterprise architecture covers all areas of your company to a certain level of detail. So in every organization, we have lots of different domains. And theoretically, EA is the practice that ties all of these domains together at the top level. But each different domain can use various or kind of specific notations. So like the business strategy, we've got the enterprise structure using the business processes, which is the typical content of BPM tools using the BPMN 2.0 standard. Then there you've got your typical kind of content management system, or a CMDB, which you use to manage the various software components, servers, and platforms. But each of these systems all have different types of data structures that are all captured to a different level of detail. So with enterprise architecture, we have a way to try and capture everything using a consistent language. And then we use this to define and create the interdependencies that exist between the various domains that we have. So looking at it slightly differently, we can use the analogy from urban planning. So we can relate kind of enterprise architecture to the more widely understood concept of city planning. So in city planning, you've got different zones established for various purposes. You've got buildings that are built in these zones, and they're constructed to the specifications to meet the defined purpose. So an enterprise architect is not like an architect building just a single building, but more like an urban planner designing a city that's full of buildings. So using the development plan for a new city, it would be similar to your IT blueprint for enterprise architecture. If we consider the building regulations that the planners must adhere to, we can relate those to the architecture principles that are defined in TOGAF for enterprise architecture. But a specific building plan might relate to the software architecture, but the software architecture is not really part of enterprise architecture because there's two, the level of detail here is really too specific. So let's say that we've an application or a solution architect responsible for designing applications. And in our analogy here, they would actually be the buildings in a new city plan. So this is something similar to the building architect's plan of designing and modeling something before it's actually built. Because sometimes you can be very much focused on a single application in an enterprise, or it could be a single building in a city. So we would also have the civil engineers then who would decide on the groundworks like bridges and tunnels and external elements that are in the city, which would be similar to your infrastructure architects if we think about enterprise architecture, because they provide the shared services that all of our applications require. And then without any of the kind of raw materials like bricks and mortar in terms of building our cities, the applications without any data would just remain as empty shells. So really from the kind of highest level of detail, the enterprise architect needs to have a good grip of kind of everything that constitutes the enterprise architecture as a whole, just as a city planner. And a city planner must avoid kind of urban sprawl, poor public transport, and we also must make sure that the citizens have the required kind of amenities to use. And then in doing so, we can ensure that the objectives of the organization are being met and that the governing principles that have been defined are being followed. So if we look at another example, we can see why we need to have a kind of a basic understanding of architecture. So a good example here is the famous landmark in California called the Winchester House, which was a mansion that was renowned for its size, but it also had a lot of architectural curiosities and really a lack of any kind of master building plan. But it's also kind of a great analogy to how many organizations have been constructed. So this house consisted of 161 rooms, 4 floors, lots of bedrooms, 47 fireplaces, and thousands of panes of glass. But because the building was built by piecemeal, there was no kind of future vision or plan, and basically new rooms were constantly being added, and doors that didn't go anywhere, and other windows that were overlooking other rooms. So basically a uniform blueprint didn't exist. So single parts in the house were in and of themselves well made, but in the overall picture they made no sense at all. So many organizations can find themselves in a similar kind of a situation where the kind of structure and form emerges without any kind of overall blueprint or architectural integrity. So in a business, maybe business processes are kind of bolted on just in response to new products that are released or new products that are being developed, as well as services, but you don't have systems to actually support that. Similar to any kind of local or departmental initiatives are kind of just added on ad hocly, and policies are therefore ignored. So the obvious results here is going to be kind of inconsistent business logic. You're going to need multiple kind of workarounds. There'll be lots of redundancy instead of kind of reuse, and incompatible technologies and so on. So the inevitable result in an organization is going to be kind of too much complexity, and then the inability to respond to changing kind of conditions in the market. So our goal is to make architecture kind of fit for the future, and regardless of whether it means kind of clearing out or tidying up or harmonizing, or just relying on more future-oriented capabilities, processes, or technologies. So basically it's important to be aware of your kind of existing current architecture and the as-is state, but you also need to build your future state architecture using a more kind of project-oriented approach, and that over time are adhering to some predefined principles that you have. Okay, and then in the end we resulted target architecture, which is then more flexible to be able to meet the various business demands, any kind of technological changes, or any market changes that happen. You're in a better position to react to those. Okay, so let's move on and see how we can get started with an enterprise architecture initiative and how it relates to the open group architecture framework. Firstly, we can just take a look at the kind of role of an enterprise architect. If we look at a typical kind of job description for an IT architect, we can see quite quickly that the architect's involved in topics such as designing and implementing the IT architecture. So the IT architect is there to understand the interdependencies and to develop them further. He must be able to assure that the architecture principles and the requirements that he defines will be kind of realized and implemented during projects that you have. But the enterprise architect must also be able to cope with various questions about both his defined requirements and to ensure that they're kind of compliant. So for example, if a new IT application that's been introduced, to make sure that it fits with the IT architecture, and also to be able to be aware of what the impact could be of decommissioning another application, or what the impact of a change to an application could have on the other kind of interrelated or dependents that are associated with the application. So in this sense, the Open Group have invented many years ago the Open Group Architecture Framework to support such initiatives. So here is an overview of the architecture development method from TOGAF. So it basically describes a method for developing and managing the life cycle of an enterprise architecture, and really forms the core of TOGAF. And you can see here it consists of a number of different phases, starting with the preliminary phase, where you basically are trying to prepare the organization for the EA initiative, defining the architecture principles, defining your procedure model, so how you actually plan to go about implementing enterprise architecture. In the architecture vision phase, this is where you define the scope and also the involved stakeholders. Then in phases B, C, and D, where you have the business architecture, the information systems architecture, and technology architecture, you are looking here to define both your current and target state architectures, but also performing the kind of gap analysis to see what changes need to happen to deliver on the target state architecture. You prepare your roadmaps and basically select the different views that you need and also any reference models that you would like to use. In the opportunities and solutions phase, here we can define and prioritize our projects for delivering that target state that's been defined. Migration planning then involves kind of finalizing the architecture roadmaps that you have and really managing the kind of implementation plan. And then the final two phases kind of monitor the implementation of the projects and supports the kind of ongoing change management processes that will happen as a result of the changes that are implemented. And in the center of the ADM, we have the requirements management, where we define the requirements for both the current and the next projects or cycles through the ADM again. So for today, to really see how we can really get an EA initiative off the ground and what we need to do to start one, we're going to take a look at the steps that we have in the two early phases of the ADM cycle. So before we get started, there's going to be some questions that you'll need to consider, such as how you're going to actually manage your architectural information. You also need to consider how you're going to control the development of the architecture, so what kind of governance is going to be in place, and also where the EA function is going to be positioned in your company. So actually who should be involved and who should assist in the EA activities. So how to manage the architectural information, you should really try and use a kind of architecture repository to actually manage the data. This information is going to be the key to answering the questions about things like what technologies are currently used by a specific application, and with a repository really as a kind of a central information source for all of your architecture kind of relevant data. So it's a place where you're going to store all the information about your applications, their interfaces, what are the supported processes, and so on and so forth, using the defined description model that you have. So we can control the architecture and its future development by defining the architecture principles, and then also to always be constantly kind of questioning and evaluating the kind of architectural conformity to those defined principles. So to make sure anything that's happening within your architecture is being related to a specific principle that's being defined in the early stages of the ADM. And then from a kind of positioning perspective, you need to see where the EA function is going to fit into your existing organization and really how the EA function is going to align with your already existing company's business processes. And then you will need to define some new processes and responsibilities to then kick off the initiative as well. So to help with answering some of the initial questions that you encounter during the first couple of phases of the ADM, we've put together this procedure model. So again, depending on your specific objectives, which will need to be defined in the first scoping activity, different questions will need to be answered, and therefore different evaluations and analysis and reports are going to be required. So it's important to define the kind of EA stakeholders who are going to be taking part in the initiative, as well as defining the kind of architecture principles that all projects will need to conform to. So each of the different kind of stakeholders or stakeholder groups are going to have certain requirements that will need to be addressed. So the processes, roles and responsibilities, as well as the kind of desired results or deliverables will also need to be defined. So but what has to be maintained in the architecture strongly influences the requirements for the description language that you choose to actually document the architecture. So we call this the kind of meta model for all of the architectural models and objects that you're going to have in the repository. And finally, we need to develop some kind of patterns or guidelines to help you to actually describe the architecture in a consistent way. So in Firstly, defining the scope of the EA initiative. You can ask questions like, what's the goal of your enterprise architecture initiative? Which kind of divisions or departments are going to be included in the initiative? Who should the stakeholders be talking to? What are the responsibilities? How are the various priorities being distributed? And you also need to make sure that it's going to be kind of an iterative approach rather than a kind of a big bang. So moving along step by step, looking for some quick wins in the early part of the process is more ideal than kind of trying to do everything at once. So the next step after defining the scope is to perform the kind of stakeholder analysis and really interviewing the various stakeholders. Yeah, the stakeholder interviews are performed to really find out what the various goals and kind of questions that need to be answered for each of the stakeholder groups that you have. And these can then be kind of summarized into individual statements, and then you use these statements to actually categorize and clearly formulate your kind of architectural principles, and then finally formally define them as well. Make sure that they're easily accessible to all. So it's also just important here to really gather the kind of stakeholder needs, because that will have an impact further down the line when you need to answer those questions with some deliverables from the repository. So here's just an example of an architecture principle related to reducing kind of data inconsistency or data redundancy. So our principle states that business objects should be created centrally in one application and distributed to other applications via interfaces. So this just means that you're going to have a kind of a master application responsible for specific data elements. And the reason for the principle should also be documented. So here we're saying that there should be just a master application defined for each business object or piece of data. You can also associate or document here what risks will be involved in the implementation. So what will be the risks if we go ahead and implement here, and if we actually don't implement, what's the risk of non-implementation. So in this case, it's the bad result where you have data inconsistency and or redundancy. So the next step then is to define the processes, the roles and the responsibilities for your initiative. And there needs to be some kind of governance processes put in place for the ongoing maintenance of the repository, but more importantly, you need to decide who should be involved and what kind of access and what tasks and who should be responsible for what. And then from there, we can then define the deliverables, such as the reports and the view types that each stakeholder requires to answer their specific EA questions. So in documenting the kind of governance processes, you need to consider what information is important and what information should be documented for each component that you're recording in the repository. So here for defining the processes and roles and responsibilities, we need to consider how the information is going to be gathered, who is going to be responsible for maintaining and updating the architecture artifacts. There needs to be some quality assessments, who's going to actually validate the data. And then also, how are you going to deliver the data to the kind of end users and who is actually going to be consuming the information that you have. So you could also have the case where somebody needs to be informed when something changes, because it could have an impact on their area of the architecture as well. The types of roles that you can have, here we've got some architects who would really be defined as the kind of power users. And then you're going to have various roles involved in the different kind of levels of the architecture domain, from application owners or technology owners, or maybe actually process managers from the business side. In ADOIT, all of our access is role-based, so the tool is really set up to make it very easy for all stakeholders involved to kind of carry out their daily tasks based on their kind of individual responsibilities. So just looking here at the meta model that we have for ADOIT. In ADOIT, we distinguish three different role types. We've got architects, contributors, and readers. And as I said, the architect really is the kind of power user for EA, who has full access to the kind of complete meta model with full modeling capabilities to kind of build the architecture, and also has the ability to define kind of new analysis views as the stakeholders require them. The architect will have kind of access to the design and document scenario, again, full modeling capabilities, and typically is going to have access to the administration toolkit to also control the kind of access rights and privileges for all kind of other users to the repository. Whereas if we look at the contributor there, who could be, for example, an application manager, the contributor only has read access and inherits kind of full access or writing access rights to the objects that he's responsible for or that he's been defined as the owner. So yeah, an example would be just an application owner who needs to maintain the data that describes the application and its dependencies. So the contributor really has no kind of modeling capabilities, but he can basically edit and update information that's related to his own objects. But he can also execute all the forms of kind of analysis, views, and queries on the repository. And lastly, the last type of kind of role that you would need to have is the reader role. So in this case, it could be it's kind of an unpersonalized view in the repository. So everybody who's associated with the reader profile has the same view in the repository. They can be either kind of authenticated or unauthenticated just by clicking on a link on a login page. But the reader is basically a consumer of information, but also has full access to the kind of reporting board and is able to execute any kind of views and reports as well. So that's just one kind of breakdown of the types of roles and responsibilities that you could have in an EA scenario. And here is just a kind of a sample overview of the types of deliverables that we need to produce based on the data from the repository. It's up to the kind of EA team to decide how best to actually deliver that to the various stakeholder groups that need them, but it's all based on the relations and information that exists in the repository. And then the last part of the process includes defining the description model and also developing the kind of patterns and guidelines for describing the architecture. But when we talk about the description model, we really mean the kind of meta model that's used, and the meta model basically provides you with all of the kind of attributes and relations needed to describe kind of architecture artifacts and their dependencies to other artifacts. Obviously the goal here is just to have a kind of a common language and a way to control the architecture with minimum efforts and kind of maximum return. So here you can just see the high-level view of the standard meta model in ADOIT. So not all kind of relations are shown here, but this would really be kind of a starting point in any new project. So you don't need to use the full meta model from the beginning. As I said, you don't really want to go for kind of a big bang approach and try and do everything at once. It's really to take what are the core elements of the meta model that you want to focus on, and it can be tailored then to any of our customers' needs. So then to help govern the architecture repository, you need to decide and document how the data is going to be managed, whether it can be managed centrally, decentrally, or it could be a kind of a combination of both. You can decide how often each object type should be evaluated and updated and who should be responsible, so we can really kind of set reminders and timelines where when a kind of a review needs to happen. You can decide from a quality perspective how and who is going to validate the contents of the repository, and also to define what the minimum level of documentation that should be provided by any of your stakeholders. So it's also a good kind of practice to define a solid structure in the model and object repository. This not only makes it easier for kind of users to find their information, but also to assist in the administration topic of setting up kind of access rights for your various stakeholder groups. Okay, so that's just a quick run through of the slides. I'm just going to jump now into the tool to run through a quick kind of demo of ADOIT just to see how our tool supports some of the things we've just talked about. So I'm going to log in here as the architect. This is the latest version of ADOIT once it logs in here. The architect, as I said, is the kind of power user within ADOIT. So in this case, I've got access to 3 different scenarios here. I've got design and documents, which we'll jump into in a moment. Control and release is really around the kind of release workflow of objects to manage the kind of versioning and manage the objects in the repository. And the govern and manage scenario is just a kind of a more high-level or helicopter view of your architecture to see how things are progressing from various kind of classification attributes and different pie charts and spider diagrams in here. But today we're going to just look into design and document. Once we log in, we get our start page here, where the most important part here is the portal here for my architecture artifact. So this is listing all of the elements in the architecture that I'm responsible for. So my Arch user, so we've got applications here, capabilities, functions, business objects, and so on. We can see from the data actuality column here how up-to-date the information is. So after a period of days, the traffic light here turns red, which means I need to go in and actually confirm that the information around my bank equity system here is actually up to date. And once it is, we can complete it, and then it switches to green for a period of time. We've got some information here on the recent changes since last week. We can see kind of what's changed in the repository. We've got some task management here, so you can set up tasks both for yourself and other users. And here we've got some quick links to go in and actually create some content here as well. So split by kind of levels of your architecture, from business, technology, and information systems. If we go here just to create a quick application, we can start documenting our application. We just create an object here for ADOIT. We can add in a description. Okay, and we can see here with the little star or asterisk symbol in red, that description here is considered a kind of a mandatory field when creating a new object. So that's one way of kind of validating the content to make sure that everybody who creates an application also has to add in a description. You can also assign responsibility to this object. So here in the organization tab, again, responsible person is also a mandatory attribute. And we can create a relation here to my user who I'm logged in as. So I'm going to say that my Arch is the responsible person for this application. If I now save my notebook here, we can switch back to the dashboard where we have a list of all of the architecture artifacts that I'm responsible for. If I do a quick refresh, now ADOIT appears here in my list of applications that I'm responsible for. As we were talking about before, so every kind of object created should be adhering to some predefined architecture principles. So if we go to our principles chapter here, we can go about assigning some architecture principles to our new application. Okay, we'll do some application principles and select a range of our application principles here. Once I click OK, it then populates the table. And from here, once I save it, go to the reader view, and now we can actually check what the status of it is of the relation between the application and the architecture principle. So if we want to edit this now, we can say that my ADOIT application is fully compliant to this specific architecture principle that we have here. So if I just go back now, for I think it was ease of use I selected, I've now said that ADOIT is fully compliant to this architecture principle. So to actually then check what other elements here we can reference to our application, maybe we can associate some data or some business object here. And I need to go back into my edit view. So we can actually create a new business object directly here from the kind of notebook for ADOIT. Maybe we just call it architecture information. Okay, click OK, so it's automatically assigned then here to our application. Again, you can save it. Go to reader view, and we can straight away here also set the properties of the relation here. So as we had said with the example architecture principle, that each application should be the master of specific data. So we can set ADOIT as being the master application for creating, reading, updating, and deleting our architecture information data. So again, we can save that. So we can also then run reports based on these types of information that are stored directly on the relation. So it's an additional way of maximizing the documentation of your repository. Okay, so if we just go back to our dashboard then, and now we can do a quick report here on the architecture principles that are associated with all of our applications to see what the current status is. If we just define a matrix view here, application by governing principle. I just need to select it on the empty space. Okay, so then on the x-axis across the top, we see all of our governing principles, and here we have our list of applications. So we can tidy up this view a little bit. First of all, just to hide any rows without any relations already predefined, and now switch the visualization here to show the compliance level of our application. So we can see here the new application that we just added, ADOIT, only has one principle defined, so we need to go and update the relations here, which we can do directly from the matrix view. But we can also look at some of the other applications. So here our partner system application, we can see that it's poorly performing in terms of adhering to the architecture principles, so it's only compliant and partly compliant for 2 of the 6. If we look into our partner system applications notebook, we can also check on the kind of classification chapter to see here that it's a strategically very important application, but we can also see some other information about how well it's fit for business, how well it's supported by IT, if it's cost effective or not. So we can see here that partner system really is underperforming as a whole. So using these attribute values in the classification chapter, we can also run a different type of view. So if we go back to our dashboard here, and we can look at a portfolio view. So with the portfolio view, we can look at all of our applications from 3 different perspectives. So we've got the IT fit, so how it's supported by IT, how well it's useful for our business, and also how strategically important it is. So our partner system application is, again, poorly performing. If we double click here on the bubble, we can also open up the notebook. We can check in the life cycle that, okay, our investment strategy here is to actually disinvest in this application. We can see that it will eventually be replaced by the business partner application. And if we check the projects chapter here, we can also see that there's already a defined project for implementation of the new business partner application. The last view type I want to just have a look at based on that information is the Gantt view. So we can see the kind of life cycle information for all of our applications. And here we can see our partner system application is coming to its end of life between Q2 and Q3, and it's going to be replaced eventually by the business partner application. So it's just a way of using the data that's been input into the repository to really generate the kind of value for your stakeholders so they can kind of get a good overview of what's actually happening with the applications and making sure that everything is being associated back to the governing principles that are defined in the early stages of the ADM. Okay, so that's the end of the kind of live demo for today. We're a little bit short on time, so I can't show too much. So I'm just going to jump back to the slides and just kind of have a quick kind of look at an example based on our kind of original principle we looked at, and also looking ahead to other scenarios that we can support, as well as a kind of a basic EA checklist that you should try and follow. So here we can see just a table where we've kind of documented how the stakeholders should adhere to the defined principle that we have. We've defined what objects in the repository it relates to, as well as the relation here where you associate the create, read, update, delete information on the relation between the application and the data object. We've also defined who is responsible for the data, and also the result type expected by the stakeholders, which is this matrix view, which we didn't quite generate in ADOIT, but this is how it would look. where you basically have your applications, the data objects, and what the CRUD information is. So we can see here that both the eShop application and the SAP both have the ability to create and update information, which shouldn't be the case. So here we can see a violation. So basically by following the kind of principle, you should be able to avoid such inconsistencies in your data here based on the deliverable from the repository. So again, today we just focused on the first two phases of the ADM, but a good foundation is really key here to being able to address the other application scenarios. And as you move through the rest of the phases of the ADM, such as application portfolio management, we've got business and IT alignments, and also project portfolio management that we can really support. So ADOIT is TOGAF certified, so we can really kind of support all of the phases of the ADM using our software. Okay, so just quickly here to run through the EA checklist. Again, it's just a kind of an overview and a recap on some of the things and the steps that you should really focus on. As I said, small kind of incremental steps are required, and no kind of EA project will be ever delivered using kind of a big bang approach. There should be kind of formal goals defined again in the beginning, and starting with a kind of a minimal but kind of goal-oriented meta model will help you to achieve your goals. So really focusing on the specific objects from the meta model that are important from the beginning. We also talked a lot about the kind of role concept and the importance of having kind of defined processes and defined responsibilities. And also really a really important step is ensuring that the kind of EA information that you have in the repository is easily accessible for all of the stakeholder groups that you have, and that any kind of success is really well kind of communicated so that you can get continued support from all the decision makers moving forward. So that's the end of my part of today's webinar. So I'd now like to pass you back to Maren, who's going to conclude today's session and let you know how you can keep in touch with us, how you can sign up for free trials of our software, and really just to contact us in the future. So thanks again, Maren.
Thank you very much, Tom. Thank you for that informative presentation as well as that very interesting live demo. So first of all, how can you start if you're deciding to start your EA initiative with our product, ADOIT, which is a next generation EA suite and is also 100% web-based, TOGAF certified, role-based access. There are a lot of different qualities to it. One thing that I should mention is it's also a worldwide leader among the international competition in the Forrester Wave for enterprise architecture management suites in the Q2 of 2017. If you want to learn more, you can go to our website, www.boc-group.com/ADOIT. And also, if you want, you can have a free trial, which is a 30-day free access trial to the full functionality of ADOIT. It also includes an EA collaboration with one other colleague, and you can get it at the same. If you have a task that requires support in implementation of EA, in the creation of application and service architectures, implementation of master data management, setup of IT, introduction to ITIL, such and such, we support you with more than 20 years of consulting experience, and you can contact us at boc-group.com/contact. So, thank you again for everything. Here is a quick list of dates and related titles of webinars and regional events. So first we have some thematic on-demand webinars coming up. There's the ADOIT 8.3 Unboxed, EA in Practice, Optimizing Business Processes, Key Criteria when Selecting an EA Tool, and Implementation of the EU General Data Protection Regulation, the GDPR. We also have a variety of useful articles and webinar recordings already pre-made. They're also waiting for you in our online library. Some events to keep in mind that are coming up quite soon is the Getting Started with ICS and Risk Management webinar, which will be on March 22nd, and also Quality Management and BPM, which is on April 5th. I have received a few questions. Unfortunately, we are running a little bit short on time, but we will take a look and answer all of your questions via email after the presentation. So with that, I would like to close today's webinar, and for the remaining open questions, like I mentioned, we'll answer afterwards. I'm very happy to have seen so many people join us today, and I hope that we could meet your expectations. Please do not forget to subscribe to our newsletter to stay informed about free events and other interesting news. It gives us great pleasure to receive your feedback on this webinar, which is why you will also receive an email from us in the coming days asking for your opinion. So on behalf of Tom and I, we wish you all a very pleasant day.